The auction block stood in the town square like a wooden coffin, and 19-year-old Tobias McCready was about to be sold on it like livestock. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty ground as townspeople gathered, their faces twisted with cruel curiosity and sick entertainment. Some clutched coins, others just came to watch a young man's dignity get stripped away piece by piece. Tobias stood on that platform, hands bound behind his back, feeling every pair of eyes burning into his skin. His father's gambling debts had finally caught up to him, and the bank had decided that since the boy couldn't pay with money, he'd pay with his freedom. 7 years of labor to whoever bid highest. 7 years of his life. Gone. The auctioneer, a fat man named Clyde Rafferty, wiped sweat from his forehead as he called out to the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, we got ourselves a fine young buck here. Strong back, good teeth, and I'm told he's never been with a woman." The crowd erupted in laughter and jeers. Tobias felt his face burn with shame, but he kept his chin up. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. "What am I bid for 7 years of this boy's service?" Rafferty shouted. "He can work your fields, tend your cattle, fix your barns, and for you lonely ladies out there..." More disgusting laughter filled the air. Tobias wanted to disappear into the earth itself. A voice from the back called out, $50! It was Samuel Boone, the blacksmith known for working his apprentices half to death. Another voice, $60! This from Margaret Tate, who ran the local saloon and had a reputation for being cruel to her workers. As the bidding continued, Tobias scanned the crowd, looking for any face that might show him mercy. But all he saw were hungry eyes and greedy smiles. These people weren't seeing him as a human being. They were seeing 7 years of cheap labor. Or worse. The bids climbed higher. $70, $80, $90. Each number hammered into Tobias like a nail in his coffin. He thought about his father, rotting in the ground after drinking himself to death, leaving nothing but debts and shame. He thought about his mother, dead since he was 12, who would be horrified to see her son standing on this block. $100, shouted a voice that made Tobias's blood run cold. It belonged to Magnus Grundy, a cattle rancher with hands like ham hocks and a reputation for violence. Grundy grinned up at Tobias, showing yellow teeth, and the boy knew exactly what kind of hell awaited him on that ranch. The crowd fell silent. $100 was more money than most of them had seen in months. Rafferty raised his gavel, ready to seal Tobias's fate. "Going once for $100 to Mr. Grundy." That's when she spoke. $200. The voice came from the edge of the crowd, calm and clear as mountain water. Every head turned toward the sound, including Tobias's. Through the sea of faces, he saw her, a woman in a simple brown dress and worn boots, standing apart from the others like she owned the very ground beneath her feet. But what happened next would change everything Tobias thought he knew about mercy, about second chances, and about the woman who just saved him from a fate worse than death. Martha Caldwell stood at the edge of that crowd like a stone wall against a storm. $200, more money than most folks in Deadwood Junction had ever seen at once. The silence stretched so tight you could hear a pin drop on the dusty ground. Rafferty's gavel froze midair. His mouth hung open like a fish gasping for water. Magnus Grundy's face turned red as a fresh burn, his eyes darting between Martha and the boy on the platform. "Now hold on just a minute," Grundy snarled, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. "That woman's got no business bidding on a strong young man like that." Martha stepped forward, her boots clicking against the wooden planks as she moved through the crowd. People parted like the Red Sea, some out of respect, others out of fear. Everyone in town knew Martha Caldwell. She'd built her cattle ranch from nothing after her husband died, and she didn't take nonsense from anybody. "My money's as good as yours, Magnus," she said, her voice steady as bedrock. "Better, considering I actually have it." The crowd murmured at that. Everyone knew Grundy was always behind on his debts, always promising payment next month. Tobias watched this woman approach the platform, trying to read her face. She had steel-gray hair pulled back severe and tight, lines around her eyes that spoke of hard years and harder choices. But there was something else there, something he couldn't quite place. Her eyes weren't hungry like the others. They weren't cruel. Rafferty cleared his throat, sweat now pouring down his fat cheeks. "Well, Mrs. Caldwell, that's quite a generous bid, but perhaps you should think about what you're getting yourself into. This boy's got 7 years of labor to give, and that's a lot of work for a woman running a ranch alone. Are you questioning my ability to handle my own affairs, Clyde?" Martha's voice dropped to just above a whisper, but it cut through the air like a blade. Rafferty visibly shrank back. No ma'am, not at all. I just thought, you thought wrong. She reached into her coat and pulled out a leather pouch, heavy with coin. The metallic sound it made when she shook it silenced any remaining objections. $200, cash money. Are there any other bids? The crowd looked around nervously. $200 was more than most of them made in a year. Grundy's face was purple now, but he knew when he was beaten. He spat again and stalked away, muttering curses under his breath. Going once, Rafferty called weakly. Going twice. He looked around desperately, hoping someone else would bid. But the silence stretched on. Sold to Mrs. Martha Caldwell for $200. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through Tobias's bones. Just like that, his fate was sealed. But instead of the crushing despair he'd expected, he felt something strange. Relief. This woman had saved him from Magnus Grundy's ranch. But why? What did she want with him? Martha counted out the money with careful precision, placing each coin in Rafferty's sweaty palm. The crowd began to disperse, disappointed that their entertainment was over. Some shot curious glances at Martha and Tobias, already starting the gossip that would spread through town like wildfire. When the transaction was complete, Martha walked over to where Tobias stood. Up close, he could see the deep lines in her face, the calluses on her hands, the way she carried herself like someone who'd fought for everything she had. She looked him up and down, not like she was examining property, but like she was trying to see inside his soul. "Can you ride?" she asked simply. "Yes, ma'am," Tobias replied, his voice hoarse from the morning's ordeal. "Good. We've got a long way to go." She turned toward where a horse and wagon waited at the edge of the square. "And boy?" She paused, looking back at him with those unreadable eyes. "Whatever you think you know about why I bought you, you're wrong." As they walked toward her wagon, Tobias couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just stepped from one mystery into another. And somewhere deep in his gut, he sensed that Martha Caldwell was harboring secrets that ran deeper than any mine shaft. The wagon wheels creaked against the rocky trail as they left Deadwood Junction behind. Tobias sat beside Martha on the wooden bench, his wrists still raw from the ropes that had bound him at the auction. The morning sun climbed higher, casting harsh shadows across the desert landscape that stretched endlessly before them. Martha hadn't spoken a word since they'd left town. She kept her eyes fixed on the trail ahead, her weathered hands steady on the reins. The silence between them felt heavier than the desert heat pressing down on their shoulders. Tobias stole glances at her, trying to understand what kind of woman pays $200 for a stranger. After an hour of nothing but creaking wheels and horse hooves, Tobias finally broke. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, why did you bid on me?" His voice came out smaller than he'd intended, like a child asking why the sky was blue. Martha's jaw tightened, but she didn't look at him. "You got questions, boy. That's natural, but some answers cost more than others. Right now, all you need to know is that you're not going to Magnus Grundy's ranch, and that's a blessing you should count." "But $200, Tobias persisted. "That's more money than most folks see in their whole lives. You could have bought 5 horses or cattle, or I could have let that animal Grundy work you to death in his mines." Her voice cut through the air like a whip crack. "You think I don't know what he does to the boys who work for him? You think the whole town doesn't whisper about the ones who go to his ranch and never come back?" A chill ran down Tobias's spine despite the heat. He'd heard rumors about Grundy's place, dark stories told in hushed voices, boys who disappeared, accidents that weren't really accidents, workers who tried to run and were found weeks later, if they were found at all. "So you saved me," Tobias said quietly. "But why? You don't even know me." For the first time since they'd left town, Martha looked at him. Her gray eyes held something that made his chest tighten. Not kindness exactly, but not cruelty either. Something deeper. Something that looked like old pain. "7 years is a long time," she said finally. "Long enough for a boy to become a man if he's willing to work for it. My ranch needs strong hands, and you need a place where you won't get yourself killed before you're 25. The wagon hit a rut in the road, jarring them both. Martha steadied the horses with practiced ease, but Tobias noticed how her knuckles went white on the reins. She was nervous about something, though she was trying hard not to show it. "What kind of work?" he asked. "Cattle, fence repair, building, whatever needs doing." She paused, seeming to weigh her next words carefully. "And maybe, if you prove yourself worthy of trust, I'll teach you things that'll serve you well when your 7 years are up." "What kind of things?" Martha smiled for the first time since he'd met her, but it wasn't a happy expression. It was the kind of smile someone wore when they were thinking about ghosts. How to survive in a world that wants to grind you up and spit you out. How to stand your ground when everything's falling apart around you. They crested a hill, and Tobias saw it in the distance. A ranch house, sitting in a valley like a wooden fortress, surrounded by green pastures that seemed impossible in this desert landscape. Smoke curled from the chimney, and cattle dotted the fields like brown and black specks. "That's home," Martha said simply. But as they descended toward the ranch, Tobias couldn't shake the feeling that Martha Caldwell was hiding something terrible. Something that explained why a successful rancher would pay $200 for a boy she'd never met, and why she kept looking at him like she was seeing a ghost. The Caldwell Ranch stretched out before them like something from a dream. Green pastures fed by underground springs, sturdy barns that looked like they could weather any storm, and a two-story house that spoke of prosperity earned through blood and sweat. But as their wagon rolled through the main gate, Tobias noticed something that made his skin crawl. The place was too quiet, too empty. No ranch hands working the fields, no voices calling out morning greetings, just silence and the sound of their wagon wheels on packed earth. For a spread this size, there should have been a dozen men working. Instead, it felt like a ghost town. Martha pulled the wagon up to the house and climbed down without a word. Tobias followed, his legs stiff from the long ride. The wooden porch creaked under their feet as she led him to the front door, but she paused with her hand on the handle. "Before we go inside," she said, her voice harder than it had been on the trail, "we need to get something straight. This ranch operates on respect and hard work. You pull your weight, you'll be treated fair. You slack off, cause trouble, or try to run." She turned to face him, and her gray eyes had gone cold as winter stone. "Well, let's just say Magnus Grundy won't be the worst thing that ever happened to you." Tobias nodded, though his mouth had gone dry. "Yes, ma'am." "Good." She opened the door and gestured for him to follow. "Your room's upstairs, second door on the right. Get yourself cleaned up and meet me in the kitchen in 10 minutes. We've got work to do." The inside of the house was as impressive as the outside. Polished wood floors, furniture that looked like it came from back east, and windows that let in streams of golden sunlight. But as Tobias climbed the stairs, he noticed something else. Family portraits lined the hallway, but in every single one the faces had been scratched out with something sharp, deep gouges in the canvas where eyes and mouths should have been. His assigned room was simple but clean. A bed, a washstand, and a small window that looked out over the pastures. He splashed water on his face and tried to make sense of what he'd gotten himself into. A rich widow living alone on a ranch that should need a dozen workers but seemed to employ none. Destroyed family portraits. And those eyes that looked at him like he was someone else entirely. 10 minutes later, he found Martha in the kitchen, standing over a pot of coffee that smelled like heaven itself. She'd changed from her auction clothes into work pants and a cotton shirt, and with her hair loosened, she looked younger, almost vulnerable. "Sit," she commanded, pouring him a cup of coffee. "We need to talk about expectations." Tobias sat at the wooden table and wrapped his hands around the warm mug. The coffee was the best he'd ever tasted, rich and strong enough to wake the dead. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, where are all your ranch hands?" Martha's face darkened. "I work alone, have for the past 3 years. Found that hired help tends to bring more problems than solutions. But a ranch this size is my business to run as I see fit." Her voice cut through his objection like a blade. "Your job is to do what I tell you when I tell you without questions. Starting now." She walked to the window and pointed toward a field where a section of fence had collapsed. "That fence needs rebuilding before nightfall. Posts, rails, wire, everything's in the barn. You'll find tools there too. I expect it done right the first time." Tobias looked at the fallen fence, then back at Martha. The job would take 3 men most of a day to complete properly. "Ma'am, that's a lot of work for one person to... Are you telling me you can't handle it?" The challenge in her voice was unmistakable. "No, ma'am. I'm just saying it might take longer than you'd better get started." She turned away from him, dismissing him like he was nothing more than another tool to be used. "Lunch is at noon, supper at 6. Miss either one, and you'll go hungry until the next meal." As Tobias headed toward the barn, his mind raced with questions. Why was she testing him so hard? What happened to the other workers? And why did she keep looking at him with those haunted eyes? But it was the destroyed portraits that bothered him most. Someone had taken great care to scratch out every face in those family pictures, gouging deep enough to damage the canvas beyond repair. The question was, had Martha done it herself, or was there someone else living on this ranch? Someone she didn't want him to know about. The fence work nearly killed him. By noon, Tobias's hands were raw and bleeding. His back screamed with every movement, and sweat poured down his face like a river. But he kept working, driven by something deeper than fear. A desperate need to prove he was worth more than the price Martha had paid for him. When the dinner bell rang, he'd managed to replace 4 fence posts and string new wire between them. It wasn't the whole job, but it was more than any reasonable person could expect from one man in half a day. He stumbled toward the house, every muscle in his body protesting. Martha was waiting on the porch, her arms crossed, watching him approach. Her expression was unreadable, but he caught something that might have been approval in her eyes. "Wash up," she said simply. "Food's getting cold." The meal was better than anything he'd eaten in months. Beef stew with vegetables that must have come from her own garden. Fresh bread still warm from the oven, and more of that incredible coffee. They ate in silence for several minutes before Martha finally spoke. "You did good work out there. Better than I expected." "Thank you, ma'am." Tobias paused, gathering courage for the question that had been eating at him all morning. "Ma'am, can I ask you something personal?" Martha's spoon stopped halfway to her mouth. "Depends on what it is. Those pictures in the hallway, the ones with the faces scratched out. What happened to them?" The silence that followed was so complete that Tobias could hear his own heartbeat. Martha set down her spoon and stared at him for a long moment, her gray eyes filled with something that looked like old wounds that had never properly healed. "You're a curious boy, aren't you?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I didn't mean to pry." "No." She stood up abruptly and walked to the window, her back to him. "No, you deserve to know. If you're going to live here for 7 years, you deserve to understand what kind of house this is." She was quiet for so long that Tobias thought she'd changed her mind about telling him. When she finally spoke, her voice was hollow, like an echo from a deep cave. "Those pictures were of my family, my husband, my son." She turned back to face him, and Tobias saw tears in her eyes that she was fighting hard to keep from falling. "They died 3 years ago. Accident with a spooked horse in a cliff that was too close to the trail." "I'm sorry," Tobias said, and meant it. "I scratched out their faces because I couldn't stand to look at them anymore. Couldn't stand the way they smiled at me from those frames, like they were mocking me for still being alive when they weren't." Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "My boy was 19, same age as you." The words hit Tobias like a physical blow. Suddenly everything made sense. Why she'd bid on him, why she'd paid so much, why she looked at him like she was seeing a ghost. He wasn't just a ranch hand to her. He was a replacement for the son she'd lost. "That's why you bought me," he said quietly. "Because I remind you of him." Martha's composure cracked, and a single tear rolled down her weathered cheek. "His name was Daniel. Danny. He had your eyes, your build, the same stubborn way of setting his jaw when he was determined to prove something." The weight of this revelation settled on Tobias's shoulders like a lead blanket. He wasn't just working off his father's debts. He was living as a substitute for a dead boy, trying to fill a hole that could never really be filled. "If you were Tobias, what would you do? Stay and give this broken woman the comfort she desperately needs, knowing you'd be living a lie, or leave and condemn her to face her grief alone? Tell me in the comments. I need to know which side you'd choose." Because what Tobias decided next would determine whether Martha Caldwell found peace or lost herself completely to the ghosts that haunted this ranch. Tobias sat in stunned silence, staring at Martha as she wiped that single tear from her cheek. The kitchen suddenly felt too small, too heavy with the weight of her confession. He understood now why the ranch felt so empty, why she lived alone, why she'd paid $200 for a stranger who reminded her of her dead son. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I can't be him. I can't be Danny. I know that." Her voice was sharp, defensive. "You think I'm some crazy old woman who's lost her mind with grief? I know exactly who you are, Tobias McCready. You're a boy with no family, no money, and no prospects, just like Danny was before I raised him to be something better." She walked back to the table and sat down across from him, her composure mostly restored, but Tobias could see the cracks in her armor, the way her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her coffee cup. "The difference is," she continued, "you've got something Danny never had. You've seen the bottom. You've stood on that auction block and felt what it's like to have your life put up for sale. That kind of experience either breaks a man or makes him stronger than steel. And what if it broke me?" Martha studied his face for a long moment. "Then you wouldn't have worked on that fence all morning without complaining. You wouldn't have asked about my family instead of just keeping your head down and doing your time." Broken men don't care about other people's pain. Outside, the afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon. Tobias knew he should get back to the fence work, but something in Martha's eyes told him this conversation wasn't over. There was more she needed to say, more she needed him to understand. Danny was a good boy, she said quietly. Smart, hard-working, kind to animals and respectful to his elders. But he was soft, protected. He never had to fight for anything because his father and I made sure he never wanted for nothing. That doesn't sound like a bad thing. It wasn't. Until the day it got him killed. Martha's voice turned bitter. He was riding the East Trail checking on strays. Simple job, one he'd done 100 times before. But when his horse spooked at a rattlesnake, Danny didn't know how to handle it. A harder man, a man who'd faced real danger, might have stayed in the saddle. But Danny, she shook her head. Danny went over the cliff with that horse. Died on impact. The pain in her voice was so raw that Tobias felt it in his own chest. He wanted to say something comforting, but what words could possibly heal a wound that deep? I blamed myself for months, Martha continued. Told myself that if I'd been a different kind of mother, if I'd let him face some hardship, learn to handle trouble, maybe he'd still be alive. Maybe he'd have been strong enough to survive what killed him. You can't know that. No, I can't. But I can make sure the same thing doesn't happen to you. She leaned forward, her gray eyes intense. 7 years, Tobias. 7 years to turn you into the kind of man who can survive anything this world throws at him. The kind of man Danny should have been. Tobias felt the weight of her expectations settling on his shoulders. She wasn't just offering him work. She was offering him a chance to become something more than the frightened boy who'd stood on that auction block. But the price was living as a constant reminder of her greatest loss. And what happens after 7 years? He asked. After 7 years, you'll be free to go wherever you want. Do whatever you choose. But you'll go as a man who knows his own worth, not as a boy running from his father's mistakes. Thunder rumbled in the distance. And through the window, Tobias could see dark clouds gathering on the horizon. A storm was coming, and something told him it was going to be a bad one. There's something else, Martha said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. Something I haven't told you about this place. About why I really live alone. The way she said it made Tobias's blood run cold. Whatever she was about to reveal, it was going to change everything he thought he knew about Martha Caldwell and the ranch that was now his home. And as the first drops of rain began to patter against the windows, he realized that some secrets were darker than others. The rain hammered against the kitchen windows like angry fists as Martha's words hung in the air between them. Tobias could feel his heart pounding in his chest, and something deep in his gut told him he wasn't going to like whatever she was about to reveal. The reason I live alone, Martha began, her voice barely audible over the storm, isn't just because I prefer it that way. It's because the last 3 ranch hands I hired, they didn't work out. What do you mean they didn't work out? Martha stood up and walked to a cabinet in the corner of the kitchen. She opened it and pulled out a bottle of whiskey. Pouring herself a generous measure, her hands were shaking again. The first one was a man named Carter Willis. Big fellow, strong as an ox, came highly recommended from a ranch up north. He lasted 2 weeks. She took a sip of whiskey and winced. Found him one morning in the barn, beaten to death with his own shovel. Tobias felt the blood drain from his face. Beaten to death. By who? That's what I asked the sheriff. That's what I asked myself every night for months afterward. Martha's eyes had gone distant, like she was seeing something terrible that only she could perceive. No signs of robbery, nothing missing. Just a good man dead for no reason anyone could figure. The thunder crashed overhead, making both of them jump. Lightning illuminated the kitchen in stark white flashes, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The second man was named Pete Jameson. Younger fellow, probably around your age. He'd been working here about a month when it happened. Martha took another drink, larger this time. Found him at the bottom of the well. Sheriff said he must have fallen while drawing water, but Pete was careful. Too careful to just fall. And the third? Marcus Reed. Lasted longest of all, almost 3 months. I started to think maybe whatever had happened to the others was just bad luck. Coincidence. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Then one night I heard screaming from the bunkhouse. By the time I got there with my rifle, Marcus was gone. Just gone. Like he'd vanished into thin air. Tobias's mouth had gone completely dry. Did you find him? 3 days later. Or what was left of him? Martha's voice was barely a whisper now. The animals had gotten to him by then. but the sheriff said it looked like he'd been dragged for miles. Rocks, thorns, cactus, scraped raw all the way down to bone in places. The implications of what she was telling him hit Tobias like a physical blow. 3 men dead. 3 unexplained deaths on the ranch where he now lived, where he was bound to work for 7 years. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "are you telling me there's someone out there? Someone who's been killing your workers?" Martha met his eyes, and what he saw there chilled him to the bone. "I don't know what's out there, Tobias. I wish I did. All I know is that good men keep dying on my land, and I can't explain why." Lightning flashed again, and in that brief moment of illumination, Tobias could have sworn he saw a shadow move past the kitchen window. But when the darkness returned, there was nothing there. "Then why did you bring me here?" he asked. "Why put me in danger?" "Because maybe you're different. Maybe you're strong enough to survive whatever's out there." She finished her whiskey in one gulp. "Or maybe I'm just a foolish old woman who can't stand to be alone anymore." A sound came from outside, a low, keening wail that didn't sound quite human. It could have been the wind, but the way Martha's face went white told Tobias it wasn't. "What was that?" he whispered. Martha was already moving toward the rifle rack by the door. "That," she said, pulling down a lever-action Winchester, "is why we lock the doors at night, and why you're going to sleep in the house instead of the bunkhouse." Another wail echoed across the ranch, closer this time, and through the rain and thunder, Tobias heard something else, the sound of footsteps on the wooden porch outside. Someone was out there, someone who'd been waiting for him to arrive. The footsteps on the porch stopped directly outside the kitchen door. Martha gripped her rifle with white knuckles, and Tobias could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. The silence stretched between the thunder crashes, heavy with the promise of violence. Then came the knock. 3 deliberate raps on the wooden door. "Mrs. Caldwell?" The voice was rough, weathered, but undeniably human. "It's Sheriff Briggs." "Open up, please." Martha's shoulders sagged with relief, but she didn't lower the rifle. "How do I know it's really you, Sheriff?" "Because I'm standing in a goddamn thunderstorm asking politely instead of kicking down your door. Now let me in before I drown out here." Martha unlocked the door and pulled it open. Sheriff Briggs stepped inside, water streaming from his hat and coat. He was a lean man with gray hair and tired eyes that had seen too much. His gaze immediately found Tobias. "So this is the boy from the auction," Briggs said, removing his hat and shaking off the rain. "Heard you paid quite a premium for him, Martha." "My business is my own, Sheriff." Martha's voice was carefully neutral. "What brings you out here in weather like this?" Briggs looked between Martha and Tobias, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "Found something today. Something I think you both need to see." He reached into his coat and pulled out a leather satchel, worn and stained with age. "Recognize this?" Martha's face went pale. "That's Danny's. He had it with him the day he—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "Found it this morning in a cave about 2 miles from where Danny died, along with some other things." Briggs opened the satchel and carefully removed several items: a gold pocket watch, a silver ring, and what looked like torn pieces of clothing. These belonged to Carter Willis, Pete Jameson, and Marcus Reed. The kitchen fell silent except for the rain beating against the windows. Tobias felt sick to his stomach as the implications became clear. "Someone's been collecting trophies," Briggs continued. "Someone who's been killing on this ranch for years, and I think I know who." Martha's rifle clattered to the floor. "No, Danny died in an accident. His horse spooked and—" "Martha," Briggs's voice was gentle but firm, "Danny didn't die in any accident, and he didn't die 3 years ago." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Tobias grabbed the back of a chair to steady himself as Martha stared at the sheriff in shock. "That's impossible. I buried my son. I saw his body. You buried someone. But it wasn't Danny. The body was too damaged to identify properly, and you were too grief-stricken to look too close." Briggs pulled out a final item from his coat, a recent photograph. "This was taken yesterday in Tombstone. Recognize him?" Martha took the photograph with trembling hands. It showed a young man with wild eyes and an unkempt beard, but the face was unmistakably familiar. It was Danny Caldwell, older and harder, but very much alive. He's been living rough in the desert, coming back here at night to hunt. The cave was full of evidence, bones, personal effects, things he'd taken from his victims. Your son isn't dead, Martha. He's become something else. Something that kills for pleasure. Martha collapsed into a chair, the photograph falling from her nerveless fingers. But why? Why would he do this? Some men just break, and they break bad. Could have been the isolation. Could have been something that happened out there in the desert. All I know is that Danny Caldwell has been murdering every man who tries to work this ranch. Tobias found his voice. And now I'm here. Briggs nodded grimly. Now you're here. And he'll come for you too, probably tonight. The storm will give him cover. As if summoned by the sheriff's words, that inhuman wail echoed across the ranch again, closer than before. But now Tobias could hear it for what it really was. Not the cry of some unknown monster, but the hunting call of a man who'd lost his mind to blood and madness. What do we do? Martha whispered. Briggs checked his sidearm and looked toward the windows. We wait. And when Danny comes home, we do what should have been done 3 years ago. Outside, the footsteps began again, circling the house like a predator stalking its prey. Danny Caldwell had returned to claim his next victim, but this time he wouldn't find a helpless ranch hand alone in the dark. This time, he'd find his mother waiting with a rifle, and the truth she'd been too broken to see. The storm raged on, and in its fury, 3 people prepared for a confrontation that would finally put the ghosts of the Caldwell Ranch to rest. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to our channel for more tales from the Old West that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Now click on the video on the screen to hear a story even better than this one, with a twist so powerful you won't forget it anytime soon. Click on the video now.